Welcome to this session on fluency and reading for students who are deaf and hard of hearing. Please read the passage on this slide silently and as fast as you can. Ready? Go! What problems did you have with reading the passage? Did you stumble over any words? Did you stumble over any phrases? Do you have a clear understanding of what the passage means? What would you do next to try to help yourself understand this passage better? Please take a few minutes here to jot down your ideas. We will return to your notes later in the presentation. In this session, we will explore the importance of fluency in learning to read and the challenges for teaching fluency. Our first objective will be to define fluency as it is used in the field of general education, and then to describe how the definition of fluency may be different for students who are deaf and hard of hearing. Our second objective is to explore the relationship between fluency and phrase reading, which is actually what the whole issue of fluency is all about. Next, we will talk about the available assessments for fluency, in particular those that are targeted specifically for students who are deaf and hard of hearing. And finally, we will examine available interventions that you might be able to use. General educators define fluency as the ability to read orally with speed, accuracy, and proper expression. They tend to measure fluency by counting words correct per minute. As you know, hearing children acquire words because they are bathed in them daily, starting in the womb, and they are exposed to books and print matter long before they come to school. They start the process with a language base that deaf and hard of hearing children do not have. Based on that definition of correct words per minute, here is your next task. Please read the words on the next slide with speed and accuracy. Ready? Go! Were you able to decode them rapidly? Did you have any trouble with things like the CHO in the first and last words? Where did you put your stress in the second word? Let me say these words for you now. Inchoate, indefatigable, hoi polloi, valetudinarian, terpsichorean. Now read them again fast. Were you able to do it faster? So, knowing the correct pronunciation does help, and you probably got better. But do you know what each of them means? My point is that speed and accuracy of decoding are important, but they do not provide much support if we don't know what the words mean. The next component of the typical definition of fluency is proper expression. Find a partner and do the task described on this slide. One person will read the story on the next page, and the other will count how many times the reader had to slow down or start over in order to read a phrase with proper expression. Start this webinar again when you are ready to do the task. Remember, your objective is proper expression. Welcome back. I'm sure that most of you were able to read most of the words, right? You may have found that the words were packed very densely and used compound and complex grammar, which made the passage difficult to read. How many times did you have to slow down to read this with proper expression? How did you decide what the proper expression should be? Proper expression does not happen at the individual word level or the complete sentence level. Proper expression happens at the level of the phrase. For example, be provided and from a central location are two phrases, and proper expression occurs at those phrases. The phrase of infrequently and irregularly purchased goods is challenging to read smoothly because it is complicated. But fluent reading requires us to think of this phrase as a whole unit. And punctuation helps a little, but not always. For example, the punctuation of the second sentence starting with thus doesn't help much in figuring out the two subjects of the sentence, which are retailers and specialized service outlets. So we have learned that decoding is important, but only if we know what the word means that we are decoding. And we have learned that proper expression requires that we read in phrases to figure out the actual meaning of the larger sentence. Both decoding and phrase reading are challenges to our deaf and hard of hearing students. How does fluency differ for learners who are deaf and hard of hearing and use spoken language from fluency for typically hearing children? When typically hearing children learn to decode and read fluently, they use language they have already learned from the real world. But children with a hearing loss may not know the language they are being asked to read. One's ability to read word by word does not necessarily mean he can group words into phrases, and meaning is found at the level of the phrase. How does fluency differ for deaf and hard of hearing children who use sign language? Signers have the challenge of decoding unknown words and of struggling with phrase reading. In addition, they may struggle to read because they have not seen adequate models of proper expression through sign language during story reading. When hearing bilingual children learn a new spoken language, there is often a one-to-one correspondence between the language they know and the language they are learning to read. For example, the English phrase, "the three of us," corresponds nicely with the Spanish phrase, "los tres de nosotros." But there is no one-to-one correspondence at the phrase level between ASL and English, and so this adds an additional challenge to signing readers. Finally, teachers of deaf and hard of hearing children struggle with assessing fluency and with finding materials to use to teach it. Commonly used assessments do not provide enough information to help us decide what our deaf and hard of hearing children need. They rarely look deeply enough at what the reader is doing. And even if we do figure out what the student needs, we do not have any comprehensive interventions that address fluency, especially fluent phrase reading. In this next segment, we're going to talk about assessments that you might use to figure out what your students' fluency abilities are. Many schools today use the services of a ready-made assessment system like Ames, Webb, or Dibbles, which typically ask children either to read a passage or to retell a story. Sometimes the oral reading sample is rated for error types or miscues, and the retells are used to determine how well the child understood what he read. Most reading curriculum publishers now also include different assessment materials within their packages. These may not be useful for all deaf and hard of hearing children because they tend to be timed, and we know that deaf and hard of hearing students need additional time to think about what it is you are asking them to do. They have to process your question, then start to formulate their answer, and then search for the words or signs needed to give you that answer. This processing lag will always put them at a disadvantage on timed tests. Some teachers use words per minute charts to compare their students to others. For example, you could measure words per minute, then consult a chart on a website such as the one you see on this slide in order to see your student's grade level equivalent. That tells us what the child can't do. It does not tell us what we as teachers need to do to teach fluency. One reading assessment that has been designed specifically for deaf and hard of hearing students is the Avenue PM, which stands for Progress Monitoring. These tools are available for free in an online format. Go to the website on this slide, ask for an account, and then set up your classroom. Children take the assessments on the computer. It is a way to keep track of everyone's performance. The Avenue PM assessments are not timed, which makes it different from other assessments. It includes 4 tests. The maze test requires children to complete a sentence by choosing one of 3 options that would make sense. This gives us some information about fluency because the reader has to think about the phrase and determine if the phrase makes sense based on different options. The slash test asks children to indicate where one word stops and another word starts. This gives you some information about word accuracy, but not as much about fluency. Next, the word mark test gives children a prompt, and then children must complete the prompt. The child's response is sent to the teacher, who rates word combinations to see if they make sense. For example, the boy makes sense, but the and does not, and indicates that the child is not producing a good phrase. Kids Speak is an interesting assessment, but requires a spoken response and is timed, so be sure to use it with children for whom it is appropriate. The students read a passage and the teacher marks words missed, so this test is more like the words per minute assessments you may already be using. Combining mazes, the slash test, and word mark with your regular basic reading inventory and story retell will help you get a better picture of your students' ability to read phrases for meaning. When you listen to someone read, you can tell whether or not they are a good reader. They use expression. They have tone in their voices. They convey a mood to the story. They use lower register voices for parents' dialogue and higher register voices for children's dialogue. But when someone is reading a story face-to-face via American Sign Language, how do you know whether they are reading with speed, accuracy, and proper expression? This is a question that a colleague and I tried to address when we created the Fluency rubric for signing deaf children. We created a rubric that you can find in the book on this slide. Feel free to make a copy of the rubric from the book to use with your students. My colleague and I administered the rubric to signing deaf children and found that results on this rubric correlated with their scores on the Woodcock-Johnson Reading Mastery, comprehension subtest. The children with higher rubric scores had higher reading comprehension scores. The Fluency rubric has two categories of indicators: Fluency envelope and visual grammar. We described the Fluency envelope as including the overall appearance of an individual who is signing while reading, with or without voice, that gives the visual impression that he or she is a good reader or not a good reader. When you listen to someone reading, you can tell if they are a good reader by their proper expression. When you are looking at a skilled reader reading to a deaf child via sign language, you get the same kind of impression. This visual impression of good reading happens for signers because the better they are at rendering print English into their version of signed communication, the better reader they are. We know that better skills in one language correlate with better skills in another language. Deaf readers do this through a variety of code switching and code mixing. And truthfully, if you watch deaf readers reading out loud through sign language, you see a whole range of languages from more English-like to more ASL-like. They actually use both languages to get the message across. In the second part of the Fluency Screener, we looked at those key elements of signing, whether English or ASL, that demonstrated to an observer that the reader had visualized the meaning of the story. Thus, the visual grammar elements allow us to see if the reader can look at the print, form it into meaningful units, and then express those units in meaning clearly, no matter which language they are using to express those thoughts. Let's take a few minutes now for you to write down your thoughts so far. Please answer the prompts on the slide and share them with your fellow webinar participants. In this final segment, we are going to talk about available interventions, and I need to warn you up front, there are not very many of them. As with all interventions, we start at the What Works Clearinghouse to see what is an evidence-based practice for hearing children. If an intervention does not work for hearing children, then why would we expect it to work for deaf and hard of hearing children? Unfortunately, the interventions I have seen on the What Works Clearinghouse website for Fluency tend to focus on speed and accuracy. We know that this is not sufficient for deaf and hard of hearing students. An intervention that has a good rating from the WWC for its fluency components is Sound Partners by Patricia Vattisi. However, this is a phonics-based program and describes fluency as words correct in an allotted time period. In fact, all of the WWC programs with a fluency component examined it from a words correct per time perspective, which we know is insufficient for deaf and hard of hearing students. When there are no useful interventions to modify from the WWC, we must turn to those that have been successful with other struggling groups, such as children with specific language impairments or those who are learning English as a second language. Here again, there are almost no interventions with an evidence base. But let me show you one that I did find. Timothy Rosinski developed a phrase reading intervention based on giving students cues that would help them know where a phrase began and where it ended. It was a very simple and straightforward approach. You take a short passage, copy it, Mark the phrase boundaries in some manner for the student. Instruct the student to read the words in the boundaries as if they all belonged together. Have him repeat this several times, and then have him read it again without the phrase boundaries marked. Rosinski did this with struggling readers from 10 minutes 3 or 4 times a week for a period of time. He found that the struggling readers made progress in their reading fluency, and so I would like to suggest that you read this article and that you try this simple technique for 10 minutes a day for a reasonable span of time and see if you notice an improvement in your students. And as far as phrase reading interventions designed specifically for deaf and hard of hearing students, at this time we lay a fat old goose egg because there are none of which I am aware. But I have some suggestions for promising practices. Luckner and Urbach examined the literature on fluency between 1973 and 2009 and discovered only 4 intervention studies associated with fluency. All of the 4 intervention studies looked at repeated readings and found improved child outcomes. This is a place to start and probably is helpful because when you reread something, you figure out words and phrases, but this leaves phrase reading up to chance. I think we need to be more explicit about it. The reason we want to focus on phrases during repeated readings is that English is a phrasal language. On the right, you will see a basic list of all the types of phrases and clauses that we chunk together to create meaning. We also know that phrase reading scaffolds the reader's memory capacity, from works by Benjamin and Schwann and Flugel, and that measures of phrase reading are good predictors of reading comprehension for struggling readers, from Namvit. Because English is a phrasal language, and because phrases hold most of the meaning in a sentence, I think we need to engage in a process I call Repeated Readings Plus, where the plus is a focus on phrase reading. In this strategy, you will, first, begin with materials at the student's independent reading level while you are teaching the strategy. Help the students read the words in chunks and phrases that they can explain easily. Teach the concept of phrasing. Use the words phrase and read it fluently or read it smoothly. Any of those terms are good to teach the student. In Step 2, you will choose a phrase type that will be your focus. Using the independent level reading material you chose in Step 1, underline all the examples of that phrase type on the passage you chose. You'll want to Xerox a copy of it first, though. Here's an example of a story in which I have underlined most of the noun phrases. We can eliminate looking at the individual words in this type of task. In Step 3, provide practice with each type of phrase, changing out the nouns. Leave the function words and adjectives as they are. With today's internet, you can have your parapro make up these little tasks quite quickly. Here is an example of another phrase type. This step is based on the old principle of providing pattern practice. Step 5 happens simultaneously with Step 4, and you will ask the child to reread the original passage, encouraging him to read it smoothly. In Step 6, you will choose another phrase type and repeat the process from Step 3 forward. In Step 7, move on to another story with similar phrase types. Finally, in Step 8, after several successes at the independent reading level, You will take a step back into the child's instructional level and work systematically through all the phrase types you encounter at that level. Yes, this means that you will have to create your own materials. But until someone gets around to creating an intervention based on phrase reading, we have to do what we have to do. Now I would like you to think back to the very first activity you did, where you read a passage about anthropology. Pull out your list from that first task. What did you say you would want to do to figure out the passage? Teachers who have done this activity in the past often tell me they needed these 4 opportunities if they were going to be able to read the passage with speed, accuracy, and proper expression. They needed more time, and so mastery of fluency tasks takes time, and assessment of fluency requires time. They wanted clarification of vocabulary meaning, but specifically, they wanted to know that meaning within the environment of the difficult phrase they were trying to figure out. So fluency is a supralexical phrase reading process. And finally, once they have figured out how to say the phrases, they wanted an opportunity to reread the story. I think these 4 suggestions from readers provide a good summary of what reading fluency should entail for deaf and hard of hearing students. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to our online discussion about this topic.